Hello, my friends. I like to take the opportunity that we celebrate Labor Day today to look at this day to appreciate the economic and societal impact of hardworking Americans and to reflect on the progress our country has made as a result of the American workforce. Labor Day is celebrated on the first Monday of September every year. It has been a national holiday since June 28, 1894. So I needed to get some clothes and I found this ESD protection code. And so that's what I'm wearing here today for my little presentation. Specifically, I like to talk about some engineering thoughts about a freedom tax that I have recently developed. Some of you, probably the older ones, may remember this saying, greed is good, that Gordon Gekko, the protagonist in the movie Wall Street in 1987, used when he talked about how Wall Street works. And maybe some of you may actually remember that this was a little bit more nuanced. Essentially, he said greed, for lack of a better word, is good. And so, from my perspective, I really like to look at biology and all the wondrous things that exist in life. And when I look at that, then I like to say greed is in our DNA and fear as well. As I'm sitting here and think about freedom and taxes, I first want to look where our freedoms are actually coming from. And here is a look at the Constitution of the United States and the Bill of Rights that essentially established individual freedoms like freedom of religion, freedom to bear arms, free speech, free press, the freedom to assemble, and the freedom to petition the government. Now, this is a historic document, but then we also have to think what are the United States in reality. And so if I take now this Mickey Mouse look, I could essentially think about the United States of America as a very complex puzzle of more than 300 million pieces. And so this is a very complex picture that we are dealing with. First, I like to talk about freedom, family, and people. So maybe you have heard this. What is actually the difference between family and friends? Well, we have the freedom to select our friends. This is one of my special friends. What are people? Well, if you go and look in the United States, then you may actually find that corporations are people here because they establish that they have rights that otherwise maybe only people have. They can essentially spend unlimited amounts of money on political campaigns. So, what are taxes? I think most people could agree on the statement this is money that somebody else should pay to the government so that I have a good life. As an engineer, I'm interested in the sustainable tax rate solution space. Sustainable tax rate to me means we are not stealing from our children, which would be indicated by growing debt, and we would have a tax rate that matches average government spending, including business cycles and pandemics. We also understand this is not a one size fits all number because countries with cheap natural resources that can be exploited can operate with lower tax rates thanks to those resources. So when I think about this sustainable tax rate solution space, I'm thinking about a graph where on the x-axis we have the tax rate and on the y-axis we have a metric that we want to maximize. And here I'm looking at the sum of happiness in the society. There are two interesting extreme points. The point of zero taxes, which may seem very desirable, will probably only be possible in a society that works like the hunter-gatherers, where there are no roads and no significant infrastructure. And so that may not really be the sweet spot that we would like to live in nowadays. Now, at the other extreme end, at the 100% point, where everybody essentially gives all their income to the government, and then the government decides what clothes are you wearing and what are you doing. That is also probably a point that does not work for a realistic set of people. So somewhere in between, there may be a workable tax rate, and I'm just sketching some graphs here, thinking about the road builders like the Roman Empire, where roads were a critical resource to project power over a large area. They may have had maybe an optimum tax rate here, somewhere maybe in the 20% range. Then, if we look at a more advanced society, for example, the United States in the 1950s, where we are now seeing rotary phone builders, there's essentially more technology, more infrastructure that needs to be maintained. And when I think about this, probably the amount of happiness can be higher in that kind of society, even though the taxes that are being collected are also higher. But that is not a contradiction. You can essentially have more happiness if you pay higher taxes. And then maybe in the future, we can look at this society where we are the artificial intelligence builders. And in that society, you may have to collect an even higher amount of taxes than the rotary phone builders collected, because now you may have a population that is mostly not really working anymore, and so somehow all these people need to survive and they need to be kept happy. And the Romans already knew they needed bread and circus to keep the peace. And so if I look at this situation here, I can see that our future may require higher tax rates if we want to keep the freedom and peace. So overall, taxes are good for defense, road building, any other infrastructure. I mean, we all like to drink clean water, I guess. It provides for education, research, and also social security. Let's think a little bit about our inheritance to our children. So these can be little trinkets, rings, and other gold jewelry. But I'm thinking here about the situation of public debt, where the projections are that this debt will grow extensively, excessively over the coming years because we are not collecting enough taxes to actually pay our way. And so there used to be this time of free money where the interest rates were really close to zero, and it didn't really matter that much if debt was growing. But I think we have left this phase, and now we are essentially looking at a situation where debt is growing significantly. And when I look at this curve actually creates fear in my mind. And when I think about freedom, I think freedom is actually opposite of debt and fear. And so something has to be done so that we can actually become a free country again and not be an indebted country where most people live in fear. I feel debt is essentially like handcuffs. It really limits the things that a country can do. And so when I look at our future, then I see patterns that look kind of similar, like other countries that have been recently in the news. You may have heard about Venezuela or Argentina, where the local currencies have really suffered large inflation. And so you may also have heard in the news that some Supreme Court justices are now flying our flag upside down because they are really concerned about the state of our country. And I definitely agree when I look at this picture that something needs to be put upright here. I talked about how debt creates fear, and here I like to take a look at the fear that drives crypto coins. Here's a specific example, a historic example that I found in my father's aluminum coin collection. My father is a teacher, so our coin collection had aluminum coins. But in this collection, I found this memorable example. On the left side, you can see a three Deutsche Reichsmark coin, which is from the year 1922. And then right next to it, you can find a coin which is from the year 1923. So this is the next year. And the value of this coin was 50 million marks. And the coin was actually issued by the province Westphalia as emergency currency. So essentially, 100 years ago, the German people went through this experience that in essentially 1 year, the value of their money went pretty much to nothing. And so I think this is a fear that we all share when we see how the government is essentially issuing more and more dollars. And maybe there's other countries like North Korea who are also printing dollars, and we can't even identify those. So there's essentially other people diluting our money. And so maybe this is something where crypto technology, the blockchain technology, could be helpful. Now, in America, if there is fear and a problem, then there is also somebody who will provide a solution. And you can essentially go into your local grocery store and you can find a machine like this one here. This is a Coinstar ATM. And in this Coinstar ATM, you can essentially take your dollars and then decide if you want to buy essentially various kinds of crypto coins with your money. You can even buy Dogecoin, which was just created sort of as a joke on these other coins, because essentially there's a limitless amount of new coins that people could create. So you've got to be really careful there what you are betting on. I like to reconnect to the theme of greed is good and Wall Street. So I found this interesting graph that shows the type of tax as a share of total federal revenues from 1934 to 2018. Here, the graph shows individual income tax, social insurance tax, corporate income tax, and excise tax. Now, interestingly, in this graph, in the time of World War II, we observe that the corporate income tax and the individual income tax really went up to become the dominant shares in money that the federal government collected. Probably fighting a war was expensive, and so people needed to provide more money to the government. So this is really a point of really patriotism, as we can see in the tax graphs. Now, the interesting part in this graph now is that after World War II, the individual income share kind of stayed in the same range, around 45%. And then the corporate share quickly kind of diminishes to levels somewhere between 10 and 15%. And so we ask ourselves here, what happened there? Now, the individual income tax is essentially a labor tax. This is people who work. Think about Labor Day now. and the government exactly knows what everybody earns, and then they take a share of that. Um, then, when we look at the corporate taxes, and we can hypothesize they may have gone down because maybe after the war, the corporations did the same thing that the dinosaurs did, and they just died out. But then you may think back at Wall Street and how essentially corporations actually have grown bigger and bigger and bigger over those years. And so somehow it's not really consistent that the corporate income tax is such a small share of the federal revenues. And how did this actually happen? And so I think the explanation here is really that we see the corporations essentially uh, found that paying taxes was not so good for them. They rather have other people pay taxes. And so essentially, corporations started to invest in politicians to create tax law that was favorable to the corporations so that they essentially pay less than maybe their fair share, essentially a smaller share of the federal revenue. I mean, all these things can be discussed, and I guess we all agree it would be wonderful if taxes are paid by the other people. Now, if we look at the United States as one big family, then I'm asking myself here, how can we actually heal the US family budget and prevent essentially this explosion of debt? Now, we essentially have to find money here. And I think we also want to take personal responsibility and not ask other countries to fix our problems. And we also want to focus on realistic solutions and not proposals that want to make the United States into the crypto capital of the universe, because ultimately we know that crypto is essentially a Ponzi scheme. So that's not going to help us. I like to apply now our trusted tool of cash flow analysis to this problem. Essentially, we follow our money. And on the left-hand side, you can see like the price of a gallon of gas at a gas station in California. And this is essentially a share of the global oil market, which includes crude oil production cost, transport, refining, marketing, the lobbying of politicians, there's tax, there are profits. So it's a very murky picture there. So $5.14, why is it $5.14? Essentially, this is the price that we are willing to pay at the pump, and it could be significantly higher or lower depending on how do we actually value this product, gasoline, that allows us to drive around. Now, this is somewhat independent of the tax rate because we just look at the price at the pump and we want to drive around, so we got to buy some gas, no? So in other countries, for example, in Germany, at the same time, gas costs significantly more, and Germans, well, they can drive to the United States to get cheaper gas because you can't drive your car there, obviously. But when we look at this picture, there's a certain amount of tax that actually our government collects. And so you can think about it, some of the money that I pay at the pump essentially stays in our society. Now, on the other side, there are the oil producers, and for example, there's Russia, and now we are talking about crude oil prices, and those prices are essentially per barrel. And you may remember that there's 42 gallons in a barrel, so the cost scale with this factor of 42. Now, essentially, at this point, about $1.43 per gallon are flowing to an oil producer like Russia. And so there's essentially President Putin who is getting this money. and there is a significant amount of profit that he is making on this money, and all these profits go into his pockets. And the question is, what are the Russians doing with this money? Well, if you are following the news, you have some idea what Russia is doing with the profits from oil. Um, I picked a few pictures here. And so Russian oil profits at work, or maybe I should have themed this Russian oil profits at war, because Russia is essentially using this money to wage war on Ukraine. And so looking at this picture, I'm asking myself, how can we reduce Russia's oil profits? Now, I'm not the first one to ask this question. How can we essentially reduce Russian oil profits? Right after the war against Ukraine started, the Treasury Department essentially created a price cap mechanism on Russian oil. And it's a little bit of a clunky procedure where they try to essentially lower the prices that Russia could charge for their oil, because ultimately they didn't want to block Russian oil from the world market, because then the price of oil would have gone up. So they wanted to sort of have Russia still be able to sell oil, but make less profit. And so they created some clunky mechanism to do that. It's not really compatible with maybe free market ideas, but well, I guess we are very flexible with ideas when we don't like them. So I'm actually thinking about a mechanism that is well established and accepted, and I'm essentially talking about taxes. And so here on the top left, you see the cost of smoking related illnesses in the United States, and the cost total is like $326 billion per year, and that's combined medical care cost and then lost productivity. And these negative impacts to society have essentially motivated us to create significant taxation on cigarettes, which tells the consumers of cigarettes that they are doing something that's not good for society. And in this sense, a tax is a signal that lets people react to the signal. And it's not like forbidding the product, but it does have a significant impact, where an increase in the cigarette price essentially ultimately means people are smoking less. And so this is a benefit. So tobacco taxes are a good message to change unhealthy habits and addiction. In Europe, they actually have gone one step further. Aside from high taxes, they will also have these drastic graphic images that they put on each pack of cigarettes. And so maybe for some people, the text message is not strong enough. Maybe it would be good if there were some pictures. But essentially, what I'm saying here is um, maybe we should lean into a tax lever to see if we can use that to reduce the Russian oil profits. So essentially, what I'm now thinking about is that we can take back our money by creating a freedom fuel tax. And so in this case here, we saw with $5.14 per gallon, our government essentially gets 78 cents per gallon in taxes, and Russia makes more than that as profit. So how about if we could essentially change this picture in a way that there is $3.10 in revenue for the federal government, and essentially the price at the pump would be substantially higher, but now essentially more of the money that we pay will essentially stay on our side of this table. And so this is, in this example, the same price that Germans have already accepted to pay. And then if such a high tax was instituted, then we can think about the consumers in the United States will start to buy more power efficient vehicles. And essentially, we would be using less oil. And when there is less demand for oil, then the price can come down. And so the crude oil price may drop essentially from $60 per barrel down to $20 per barrel. And if the production cost stays at the similar level of $15 per barrel, then the profit is now essentially coming down massively, and we end up essentially with only 15 cents per gallon in profit. And so essentially at that point, the power of Russia's government to wage war on Ukraine would be significantly clipped because they just don't get so much of our money to fight this war. And so just by taxing ourselves, we could do essentially significant good. First of all, we are keeping a lot of side of the money on our side of the table, and then we essentially reduce the war that Russia is fighting. So having more money for us makes a lot of sense to me. Here's another interesting graph when we talk about the taxes on fuel. These are the global jet fuel prices in the last week here in August. Um, and the interesting part here is when you look essentially at different geographies, the jet fuel prices here were all in the realm of a little bit above $2 per gallon. And so this is significantly lower than the price at the pump that the motorists are paying. And so there is this interesting fact that if you are an affluent person that can fly on vacation multiple times a year, then you pay essentially very little taxes on sort of your luxury energy consumption, while the hard-working laborers who are driving their cars to work, they are essentially being taxed a high amount on their fuel that they burn to do actual work for society. And so there's a little bit of an unfair element here that I feel could also be addressed when we are starting to engineer a freedom tax. Why should we subsidize the travel of the affluent people and punish sort of the workers? I think there should be essentially a more fair administration of taxes to essentially discourage maybe the wasteful use of a precious resource just to have fun. I like to summarize the benefits of a freedom fuel tax that I see. It would be a strong incentive to buy fuel efficient vehicles and drive less. There will be tax revenue that can be invested in the clean energy transformation. We would show some personal responsibility and not tell other countries what they should do or how much they could charge for their oil. We can help those who need help to cope with the increased fuel cost. This may help the support of the social security system. Fewer bombs would fall on Ukraine. Maybe there's some money to reduce the federal deficit. And in the end, if we take back our money, I think we will take back control and we will take back our country. So on this Labor Day 2024, I want to state that freedom and debt are not really compatible with each other. And I hope that the United States can essentially transform itself We are always talking about the land of the free and the home of the brave. So I hope that we will become the land of the debt free, and we will be essentially the home of the brave who tax themselves. Thank you for listening to this message.